Imagine waking up to discover that the federal government actually planned to return thousands of dollars to your household, money they've been siphoning off for programs you never knew existed. That's precisely what supporters of the so-called Doge Stimulus say they can offer, thanks to a proposal that claims to free up billions in questionable or redundant spending. But here's the catch. Some power players in Washington are determined to block it. But why? Stick around until the end of this video to learn the surprising reason this fresh infusion of cash into your wallet has ignited a firestorm in DC. Let me hit you with a quick recap. What is this Doge Stimulus? Let's kick things off with a quick refresher. Despite the internet-inspired name, the Doge Stimulus isn't just a meme, it's a serious proposal that would shift large sums of already collected tax revenue directly back to American households. Unlike typical stimulus packages that rely on new legislation to authorize fresh spending, often adding to the federal deficit, proponents of the Doge plan say they've identified existing funds, money currently parked in under-the-radar programs, administrative overheads, and inflated contracts that could be put to better use. Here's the key difference. Instead of funneling your tax dollars through multiple government agencies or shipping a good chunk of it overseas, the Doge Stimulus aims to return it straight to taxpayers. The hope is that you and millions of other Americans get to decide where and how that money circulates, be it groceries, healthcare bills, debt repayment, or small business investments, rather than watch it disappear into an often untraceable bureaucracy. You might be wondering, sure, this sounds great in theory, but what does it look like in actual numbers? According to multiple conservative watchdog groups and budget analysts, there's at least $120 billion in duplicative, mismanaged, or otherwise questionable federal spending identified just in the last fiscal year alone. Some argue the figure could climb closer to $200 billion if you include programs that lack proper oversight. Supporters of the Doge Stimulus propose redirecting at least $140 billion of that total waste directly into American households. Under the most frequently mentioned version of the plan, each qualifying household would receive approximately $2,000 in a one-time payment, though some advocates push for $2,400 for families that meet specific income or child-dependent criteria. Ultimately, the exact size of the check depends on how much of this questionable spending Congress is willing to slash. To put that into perspective, if just 70 million households qualify, that would total around $140 billion in direct payments. If more waste is identified and more households qualify, the total stimulus pool could grow, potentially increasing the per-family amount or broadening eligibility. Critics dispute whether all those billions are truly wasteful, but the Doge camp argues that the numbers come from legitimate oversight reports, including some findings from the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and the Congressional Budget Office, CBO. Opponents often claim that big payouts will drive up inflation, but here's where Doge Stimulus supporters push back. They note that these funds already exist in the federal budget. This isn't new money being printed or borrowed. So, rather than fueling the money supply, it's more of a reallocation or refund of tax dollars you've already paid. In economic terms, putting money back in your hands tends to stimulate localized spending. You might use it on credit card payments, rent, groceries, or even to invest in a small business. That cash injection then recirculates within local communities, driving demand for goods and services in a more organic way than, say, funneling billions of dollars into top-heavy programs where the benefits can be hard to see at the ground level. Sure, there's a risk that any large consumer cash injection might nudge inflation upward, but many economists argue that the effect would be less pronounced than a typical stimulus check scenario. Because we're not adding brand new federal debt or printing money, we're effectively redirecting existing revenues. Contrary to some media soundbites, President Trump and many in his circle aren't calling for an end to all foreign aid. Instead, their stance has been clear. The United States should focus on helping American citizens first, ensuring domestic stability before sending billions abroad. If a foreign partnership or humanitarian initiative is in the US national interest or addresses urgent crises, Trump's team has generally been open to it. In line with that philosophy, they view proposals like the Doge Stimulus as a natural extension of America First. They ask, if the federal government has found billions in overlapping or poorly monitored foreign programs, why not reroute that funding back home to taxpayers, at least until we can be certain those overseas projects are truly serving American interests? For years, Critics have slammed big aid packages to countries with questionable governance or minimal transparency. The argument is that while some of these funds serve noble goals, like disaster relief or combating extremism, much of it is lost to corruption and bureaucratic tangles. By trimming those questionable expenditures, the Doge Stimulus aims to ensure that US tax dollars stay in the US economy, helping families, small businesses, and local communities. If we're talking about reallocating $140 billion or more, where exactly is it coming from? Here are the categories watchdogs highlight most often: overlapping or duplicative programs. A 2024 GAO report indicates that at least $45 billion is spent annually on multiple versions of the same or similar programs across different federal agencies. These range from workforce training to environmental research grants, foreign aid and defense overruns. According to conservative budget analysts, the US spends $50 to $60 billion per year on foreign assistance across dozens of countries, some with track records of corruption or minimal accountability. Plus, large overruns in defense contracts, like weapon systems that overshoot projected costs, inflate spending even further. Administrative overheads and unfinished projects. Billions more go to massive overhead costs within sprawling federal bureaucracies. Another chunk is tied up in incomplete or abandoned infrastructure projects that get stalled for years, chewing through taxpayers' dollars without delivering results. By consolidating or eliminating these wasteful expenditures, Doge Stimulus advocates believe they've identified a large enough pool to send meaningful checks like $2,000 to $3,000 to tens of millions of households. Let's step back for a moment. The debate isn't purely an economic one, it's also moral. If the federal government is collecting trillions in taxes annually, isn't it morally responsible for ensuring that money is used effectively, or returned to those who paid it if it can't be justified? From this perspective, the Doge Stimulus is less about stoking populist sentiment and more about principle. In other words, if our tax dollars are going to waste in duplicative or poorly managed programs, returning a portion of it directly to families is not just sound policy, it's the right thing to do. Despite these arguments, critics from certain media outlets to long-entrenched lawmakers are painting the Doge Stimulus as reckless and unnecessary. Why such fervent pushback? Opponents claim it threatens crucial government programs and undercuts America's global influence if foreign aid is slashed. But supporters of the Doge plan see a different motivation: fear of losing control over the budgetary process. When citizens become aware of precisely how much of their tax money is wasted, they might demand more transparency and further cuts to inefficiencies. That kind of scrutiny is terrifying to big spenders in Washington, who often rely on complex budgets and limited public oversight to keep funding pet projects or secure deals that benefit a handful of insiders. So here's the bottom line. The Doge Stimulus proposal is about returning $140 billion or more directly to the American taxpayer, potentially sending $2,000 to $2,400 checks to tens of millions of households. These funds are said to come from identified government waste, unaccountable foreign aid, and bureaucratic bloat. Critics argue the plan is too simplistic or even dangerous, but supporters see it as a major step toward prioritizing America first, without entirely dismissing global commitments. The big question is whether Washington can stomach a reallocation this massive. Because if the Doge Stimulus sees the light of day, it may set the stage for a new era of fiscal accountability, one where every budget line is scrutinized, and every dollar has to be justified before it's taken out of your pocket and handed to someone else. But isn't that a good thing? In the end, the real clash here isn't just about stimulus checks. It's about who ultimately gets to control your money. Distant government agencies or you. And that's a debate worth having, especially when there's an estimated $120 billion to $200 billion of questionable spending at stake.